back to the channel. I'm Nick Zimmerly, and so recently I got into cheese making, which if you've watched any of my videos, you might have seen one that I did on making manchego cheese, which was pretty successful. And now that I've made that a couple of times, I'm pretty confident to move on to my next cheese, which will be asiago cheese. And so that's what we're gonna be making today. So this is something we're gonna kind of tread lightly. We're gonna do a young asiago, which will be about a month old. And of course you can do this you can age this for up to a year. So maybe a little later on we'll get to that. So we're gonna get started on this 1 month old asiago cheese.
Okay, so we are going to start off with our thermophilic cultures. They're freeze-dried cultures, and so thermophilic, we're going to be using that because we'll be heating this milk up to 108 degrees at some point during our during this process. So we'll just sprinkle that over the top of the surface of the milk. Make sure you get all of that in there. And then we'll put a little saran wrap over the top so we don't get any dust in there or any little particles that you don't want in there. And we're just gonna rehydrate this for 5 minutes. And so, go ahead and remove the saran wrap. I'm gonna thoroughly mix this in. And you'll notice I've sped some of this up throughout the video. That way you're not sitting through a 25 to 30 minute video. And so, once again, we'll put the saran wrap over so no dust particles get in there. And we're just gonna let that acidify the milk for 45 minutes. And then we'll remove the saran wrap again. And so, we're gonna go ahead and add our calcium chloride. You can find this at cheese making shops online, and I have a local cheese making shop here in town. So we're gonna add that. We're gonna dilute that with a 1/4 cup of water, and then add that in non-chlorinated water. And so thoroughly stir that together, and that's gonna fortify the milk with some more calcium for a firmer set on your curds. And so next we will add our rennet, also available in cheese making shops online. And you're also going to do the same, dilute that with non-chlorinated water, 1/4 cup. And this is going to set the curds. So once you add this to your milk, you're gonna stir for no more than 1 minute, because at that point it's already starting to coagulate the milk, and you don't want to shatter your curds. So that's all stirred in. And we're just gonna let that set for 45 minutes. And so this is 45 minutes later. And so we're gonna check for a clean break, which there is a clean break. And if it's not a clean break, you can just let it set for another 5 to 10 minutes. So we're gonna cut the curds at this point. You're gonna get them as small as you can get them. So we're gonna cut perpendicular lines as well after this. And this takes a few minutes. Just take your time cutting the curds. And so after this, we're going to, if you have a curd cutter for cutting sideways, you can use that, but I just cut diagonally to get cubes. So once the curds are cut, we'll go ahead and let that set. And so I use a whisk to get even better cuts throughout. But like I said, if you have a curd cutter, you won't have to use a whisk. And so I'm gently pushing this. You don't want to stir this together. This is sped up, but you want to be gentle when stirring. And so now we're going to go ahead and stir this, and we're bringing this up to 104 degrees, and we're going to stir this for about 30 minutes. So stir gently, and if there's any curds that you might have missed when you cut, you can cut those with your ladle or whatever you're using to stir, but just remember to gently stir, and this is going to expel whey throughout this time of stirring, and you're gonna get smaller curds as you go. So what we're gonna do is just remove this from the heat, and we're gonna stir for an additional 20 minutes after this. So there's quite a lot of stirring for this cheese, but it's totally worth it. So just like we said, 20 minutes of more stirring before we're going to return back to the heat. And so at this point, we're going to heat this up to 118 degrees, which is kind of hot for cheese making, but this cheese requires it, which is why we're using thermophilic cultures instead of mesophilic cultures in this recipe. So we've been stirring, and as you can see, there's lots of whey that has been expelled from the curds, which is what we're shooting for. And so once this is at 118 degrees, we're going to remove this to place into our cheese mold. And so I have emptied my container with that I had the sous vide bath in, and so that way I don't make a big old mess on my counter. So we're just placing a cheesecloth. I like to get my cheesecloth from cheese making stores and not the grocery store, because these are more durable and they don't shed particles as much. So I've got holes at the bottom of this cheese mold, so it's straining the curds from the whey, and we're just making sure all that's strained out before we press our cheese, which will also expel some more whey. I'm almost done draining there. And so I'm just carefully, just so I don't make a big old mess, just carefully scooping out our curds. And so this is going to go through a series of presses before we actually, before we brine this before aging. And what I'm doing here is just pulling out, I'm just pulling it to tighten it so there's no creases in the cheesecloth at the bottom, just for a prettier cheese. I'm just kind of pushing this down to form it to the mold before I press it. And you'll notice all that whey on the side. There's a lot of whey expelled from these curds over the series of cook times and temperatures and stirring. Right, so on to pressing. And we're gonna press this for a couple of hours, about 10 pounds should do. And then we're gonna flip that and do another press. And so, using my new cheese press here. So we're just flipping this. I had a little whey that had settled into the top of the press. We're just going to flip this. And as you can see, we're starting to get what looks like actual cheese. Not quite done, of course. But we're gonna put this back under the press for another press about the same what we did before. And do about 10 pounds for another couple of hours. I like this cheese press because it gets a thorough press compared to the method I was using before. And so this is just being pressed again, and then we'll do one more press for a good 12 hours, and that'll be our last one. Alright, so I'm gonna flip this one more time. And it's nice and formed at this point. Still a little soft, which you just want to be careful not to break the cheese while you're flipping it. And again, I'm just I'm pulling on it to tighten the cheesecloth so there's no creases at the bottom. And so, going in for one last press for 12 hours before we brine our cheese. Our cheese, which is going to be 2 quarts of water, and we're gonna put 1 pound of non-iodized salt. I used kosher salt. We're just gonna thoroughly mix that together until all of the salt is dissolved, and that'll create an 18% brine, which if an egg floats in the brine at the top, then that means that you have a sufficient amount of salt in there. And if it does not float, you just add a little bit of salt until it does float. So at this point, we're gonna add 2 teaspoons of calcium chloride. And I've got a tablespoon, but I kind of eyeballed this 2 teaspoons. And then we're gonna add 2 tablespoons of white vinegar, which is going to prevent our cheese from becoming slimy while it's in the brine. And so we're just thoroughly mixing this together. And so 12 hours later, we're going to take our cheese out of the press, which is nice and pressed at this point. But you still want to be careful with it, because it is still a little squishy, but firm still. So put that into the brine, and we're just gonna place a plate on top of this. That way it's fully submerged, and we're gonna brine this for about between 6 to 8 hours, which I did I believe 7 hours on this, which worked out perfectly. And so I like to just cover this up, that way no particles get settled into there. So 7 hours later, I place it on a rack to dry for a couple of days. As long as there's no moisture on the surface, then it's ready to go. So I flipped it the second day, and then I placed it in a container once it was fully dried. And I have a dry curing chamber for my salamis, which is set at 55 degrees Fahrenheit and already at 75% humidity. And this container is going to produce a little bit more humidity, which will be necessary to properly age this cheese. And so throughout this time that we're aging this cheese, we're just going to flip this. And that way it can age and stay dried evenly. I feel like if you kept it without flipping it, then it would get a little moist on the bottom, which you don't want. So what I've done here is I've fed temperature controls through the side of this mini fridge, and to where I can control the temperature in here. This little dorm room fridge. And so that is sufficient for a cheese cave. And so since I do have salamis also aging in my cheese cave / dry curing chamber, I've got some white mold that ended up getting into the container and forming on my cheese, which is not horrible, but it can impart different flavors, which I didn't want this to turn out to not be asiago cheese because of that added flavor. So I kind of just scraped it off. All right, guys, moment of truth here. So before we slice into this, I just wanted to explain a couple things. As you had seen, we had some white mold, the Penicillium nalgiavense from our salami that happened to get into the container and grew on our cheese, which wasn't a problem. I scraped it off because I could have left it on there, but I was afraid that I wouldn't get an asiago cheese. I might have gotten something totally different with a different flavor, and that's not what I wanted. So I went ahead and took that out of the container and vacuum sealed this. And another thing I could have done that I should have done, but it's not mandatory, but it is, I could have done a wash, which I would have wiped it down probably about twice a week with the 18% brine solution that we brined our cheese with, just a light kind of wash, which would have created a rind. So definitely my next asiago cheese, I will do that. So I guess we'll go ahead and slice into this. I'm super excited to try this. All right, so it's a little moist, which is probably some of the whey that has been, since it's under a vacuum, some of the whey could have been pulled out, which is totally fine. So we'll just give it a pat down before we taste this. And yeah, see, it feels like it's a kind of creamy cheese, which, like I said, is not a bad thing, but I would prefer a cheese with a rind on it. So next asiago I do, I will definitely wash it every couple of days throughout the process to create that rind. So it's nice and patted down. And so let's give this a little taste. It's nice and firm as I'm slicing into it. It smells cheesy already. Perfect. It's got a nice press on it. There's no holes throughout, so that's a good thing. Oh man, smells good. Let's get a little slice. asiago cheese. That's delicious. More and more of the flavor comes through as it goes around. Another slice. Kind of a slight Parmesan-ish taste, which Parmesan it needs to be aged much longer. Like we said, this can be aged anywhere from 30 days, a month, to 1 year. At 30 days, it's delicious. I can't imagine what, maybe my next one I'll probably do a couple of months at least, but this is delicious. God, I can't wait to put this on a cheese board. That is a great cheese. So definitely gonna make that one again. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more cheese making videos. Thank you for watching.